When Emma Hartwell signed the deed to her grandfather's 100-acre farm at 32 years old, she expected to find nothing more than rusted equipment and forgotten dreams buried under decades of Nebraska dust. But hidden beneath a false floor in the old workshop, sealed behind boards her grandfather had nailed shut 20 years before his death, lay a collection of letters, photographs, and land deeds that would unravel everything her family had ever told her about who they were, where their wealth came from, and what price had been paid for the ground beneath her feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The August heat pressed down on Hartwell Farm like a hand flattening dough. Emma stood in the gravel driveway, her rental car engine still ticking as it cooled, staring at the two-story farmhouse that had anchored her childhood summers but now looked smaller somehow, diminished by time and neglect. The white paint had peeled away in long strips, exposing gray wood underneath that seemed to sag with exhaustion. The wraparound porch where she'd eaten watermelon and counted fireflies now listed slightly to the left, its boards warped and splitting. The field stretched out in every direction, a patchwork of brown and dying green that rolled toward the horizon in gentle waves. Corn should have been standing tall by now, halfway through August, but instead the stalks were stunted and sparse, victims of the drought that had gripped the region for 3 consecutive summers. The irrigation systems her grandfather had installed in the 80s sat motionless, their metal arms stretched across the fields like the bones of some enormous creature that had died reaching for water that never came. Emma had last been here for her grandfather's funeral 6 months ago. Howard Hartwell had been 87 when his heart finally quit, worn out from 9 decades of hard living and harder choices. The funeral had drawn nearly 300 people to the small Methodist church in town, farmers who remembered when Howard had been the most successful grower in 3 counties, business owners who'd relied on his patronage during lean years, former workers who spoke of his fairness and his temper in equal measure. Her mother, Catherine, had sat rigid in the front pew, her designer suit and perfectly styled hair marking her as someone who'd escaped this place and never looked back. She'd moved to Chicago 35 years ago, married a corporate lawyer, built a life of country clubs and charity galas that had nothing to do with soil or seasons or the relentless uncertainty of agriculture. "Sell it," Catherine had said flatly during the will reading at the lawyer's office in town. "Liquidate everything. The land, the equipment, the house. There's no saving a farm that's been losing money for 15 years, Emma." Dad was stubborn, but he wasn't stupid. He knew this place was dying. That's why he left it to you instead of fighting to keep it himself these last few years. The lawyer, a patient man named Gerald Morrison who'd known the Hartwell family for 40 years, had explained the situation with uncomfortable honesty. The farm was drowning in debt. $230,000 owed to the bank, another $60,000 to equipment suppliers and seed companies. The last 3 growing seasons had been disasters, first a drought, then a late freeze that killed the winter wheat, then corn prices dropping so low that harvest barely covered the cost of diesel for the combines. Howard had been leasing out most of the land to neighboring farms for the past decade, too old and too tired to work it himself. But even those lease payments hadn't been enough to cover the mortgage and operating expenses. The property taxes alone were crushing. Without significant capital investment, new irrigation systems, updated equipment, a complete overhaul of how the farm operated, there was no viable path forward. "Your grandfather held on out of pure stubbornness," Morrison had said, sliding financial documents across his desk. He couldn't bear the idea of losing land that had been in the Hartwell family since 1889. But sentiment doesn't pay bills, Emma. The smart move is to sell to one of the corporate agricultural companies. They're buying up family farms all over the county. You could pay off the debts and have enough left over to start fresh somewhere else. Emma's older brother, Marcus, had nodded agreement from his chair across the office. He was a financial analyst in Denver, wore expensive watches, and had made it clear over the years that he considered farming to be a dying profession for people without better options. "Mom's right," Marcus had added during the drive back to the farmhouse after the meeting. "Cut your losses. You've got a good career in landscape architecture in Portland. Don't throw that away trying to resurrect something that's already dead." Grandpa would understand. Logic said they were right. Every rational calculation pointed towards selling. The farm couldn't be saved, not without money. Emma didn't have an expertise she'd never developed. She'd spent summers here as a child, had learned to drive a tractor at 12, had helped with harvest enough times to understand the basics, but she'd never seriously considered farming as a life. She'd gone to college, built a career designing urban green spaces, created a life in the city that had nothing to do with commodity prices or rainfall patterns. But standing here now, looking at the house where her grandfather had been born, where he'd raised his children, where he'd died in his sleep in the upstairs bedroom with a window facing east so he could watch the sun rise over his fields every morning, Emma couldn't quite bring herself to walk away. She remembered other things about this place. She remembered being 8 years old, sitting on the porch steps while Grandpa Howard taught her to identify different types of soil by how it felt in her hands. Sandy loam crumbled differently than clay. Good topsoil had a smell to it, earthy and rich, that told you it could grow anything if you treated it right. She remembered being 13, watching her grandfather stand at the edge of a newly planted field with his eyes closed, listening to something she couldn't hear. When she'd asked what he was doing, he'd said he was listening to the land tell him what it needed. It had sounded crazy at the time, mystical nonsense, but she'd later realized he was checking soil moisture, wind patterns, temperature changes, reading the environment with senses honed by 60 years of observation. She remembered being 17, the summer before college, spending 3 weeks helping bring in the wheat harvest. It had been brutal work in 100-degree heat, 12-hour days that left her sunburned and exhausted and more alive than she'd ever felt. On the last day, her grandfather had looked at her with an expression she'd never forgotten. "You've got the gift, Emma girl," he'd told her, wiping sweat from his forehead with a red bandana. Not many people can read what the land is trying to say. Most folks just see dirt and plants. You see the whole system, how everything connects. That's rare. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't matter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Those words had stayed with her through college, through her early career, through every moment when she'd wondered if she'd chosen the wrong path. Her work in landscape architecture was good work, meaningful work, but it always felt like she was designing things for other people to enjoy rather than building something of her own. The bank had given her 90 days to assess the property and make a decision. 90 days to sort through a lifetime of accumulated equipment and records, to evaluate whether there was any possible way forward, to decide if Hartwell Farm would die with Howard Hartwell or find new life under new management. Emma grabbed her suitcase from the rental car and walked toward the house. The front door stuck, swollen from humidity, and she had to shoulder it open. Inside, the air was stale and hot, thick with dust motes that swirled in the afternoon light streaming through unwashed windows. The house had been sitting empty since the funeral, and it showed. Sheets covered the furniture in the living room. The kitchen sink held a single coffee cup, the dried remnants of her grandfather's last morning still visible in the bottom. She spent the first hour just walking through the rooms, touching things, remembering. Her grandmother's china cabinet in the dining room, still holding the good dishes that only came out for Thanksgiving. The bookshelf in the study, filled with agricultural journals and novels about the West. The photographs on the walls showing 4 generations of Hartwells standing in front of barns and tractors and fields, their expressions serious, their hands rough from work. In the upstairs bedroom where her grandfather had slept, Emma found his reading glasses on the nightstand next to a well-worn copy of Steinbeck's East of Eden. The bed was neatly made, as if he'd expected to return to it. His clothes still hung in the closet, work shirts and denim and the one good suit he'd worn to church and funerals. Emma sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself to cry. Not the polite tears she'd shed at the funeral surrounded by relatives and neighbors, but the raw grief she'd been holding back for months. Howard Hartwell had been the most constant presence in her childhood, more of a parent in many ways than her actual parents. Her mother had been too busy escaping her rural roots to pay much attention to her children. Her father had been focused on his law career. But every summer, Grandpa Howard had been there, patient and steady, teaching her about soil and weather and the satisfaction of work done well. When the tears finally stopped, Emma wiped her face and stood. Crying wouldn't change anything. She had 90 days, and she needed to use them productively. The lawyer had mentioned that Howard kept meticulous records, that everything was documented going back decades. If there was any path forward for the farm, any overlooked asset or possibility, it would be in those records. She found the farm office in a converted bedroom on the first floor. Filing cabinets lined every wall, their drawers stuffed with papers. The desk was buried under layers of documents, invoices, receipts, equipment manuals, seed catalogs. A computer from the early 2000s sat on a corner table, so old it probably couldn't even connect to the internet anymore. Emma began systematically going through the files. Financial records dating back to the 70s. Customer histories from when Howard had sold his crops directly to local mills and processors. Maintenance logs for every piece of equipment on the property. Weather journals where he'd recorded daily temperatures and rainfall for 50 years. Soil test results showing the changing composition of the fields over time. It was overwhelming, but also oddly comforting. This obsessive documentation was pure Howard Hartwell. He'd been a man who believed in knowing things thoroughly, in keeping track of every detail because you never knew when information might prove crucial. As the afternoon wore into evening, Emma began noticing something strange about the office layout. The room felt smaller than it should be. She'd played in this house as a child, knew its dimensions instinctively, and something was off. She pulled out a tape measure from the desk drawer and began measuring. The exterior wall of the house, measured from outside, was 32 feet long. But the interior wall of the office was only 26 feet from one corner to the other. 6 feet of space that didn't exist on the inside of the room. Emma stood staring at the wall, her mind racing. The wall was covered by the filing cabinets, heavy industrial units that had probably been here for decades. She pressed her hands against one of them and pushed. Despite its weight, she felt the slightest give, a subtle movement that suggested the cabinet wasn't actually attached to a solid wall behind it. She spent the next 2 hours systematically emptying and moving the filing cabinets. It was exhausting work in the humid heat, even with the windows open. Sweat soaked through her shirt, her muscles screamed, but she couldn't stop, driven by a curiosity that had become almost obsessive. When she finally moved the last cabinet aside, Emma found what she'd been looking for. Behind the cabinets, covered in decades of dust, was a door. Not a modern door, but something old, heavy oak planks held together with iron bands, the kind of door you'd find in a root cellar or storm shelter. It was painted the same faded white as the walls, deliberately camouflaged. The door had no handle on the outside, just a keyhole that looked like it required an old-fashioned skeleton key. In all her childhood visits, in all the countless hours she'd spent in this house, Emma had never seen this door, never even suspected it existed. She searched the desk drawers frantically, dumping out their contents, looking for anything that might fit that lock. Nothing. She went through her grandfather's bedroom, checking drawers and closets. Still nothing. She was about to give up when she remembered the workshop. The workshop sat 50 yards behind the house, a large metal building where Howard had kept his tractors and tools. Emma grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and walked out into the gathering darkness. The workshop door was padlocked, but she found the key on the ring the lawyer had given her. Inside, the workshop smelled of oil and metal and old leather. 2 tractors sat side by side, both at least 30 years old. Tools hung on pegboards with faded outlines showing where each belonged. A workbench ran along one wall, its surface scarred from decades of use. Emma searched systematically, opening every drawer and cabinet. In a toolbox on the workbench, beneath layers of wrenches and screwdrivers, she found a small wooden box. Inside the box was a single key, old brass, ornate in a way that modern keys never were. Her hands were shaking as she carried it back to the house. This key had been deliberately hidden, kept separate from everything else, protected and preserved. Whatever was behind that door, her grandfather had wanted it kept secret. Emma approached the hidden door, took a deep breath, and slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, well maintained despite its age. The mechanism disengaged with a solid click, and the heavy door swung inward on hinges that barely creaked. She felt along the interior wall and found a light switch. A bare bulb flickered to life, revealing a narrow room about 6 feet deep and 12 feet wide, running along the exterior wall of the house. The space was climate-controlled, she realized with growing shock. A dehumidifier sat in one corner, its display showing 40% humidity. The temperature was noticeably cooler than the rest of the house. Metal shelving lined both walls from floor to ceiling, and every shelf was filled with carefully organized materials. Cardboard boxes labeled and dated. Photo albums in protective sleeves. Filing boxes containing what appeared to be letters and legal documents. And in the center of the room, sitting on a small table, was a leather-bound journal. Emma approached the journal slowly, almost afraid to touch it. The leather was worn smooth from handling, the binding cracked with age. This wasn't something her grandfather had packed away and forgotten. This was something he'd returned to again and again over the years. She opened the journal to the first page. The date written at the top in her grandfather's precise handwriting, March 3, 1962. Beneath it, an inscription that made her blood run cold. If you're reading this, I'm gone. What follows is the truth about where our family's wealth came from and what was done to get it. I tried to make it right. God knows I tried. But some sins are too deep to wash clean. Do with this what you will, but know that every acre of land we own was bought with someone else's loss. Emma's heart pounded as she turned to the next page and began reading words that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family's legacy. The journal's first entry was written in careful, deliberate handwriting that Emma recognized instantly as her grandfather's, though younger, less weathered by time. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clearly legible. March 3, 1962. I've decided to write this down because silence has a way of becoming truth if you keep it long enough. What I did, what my father did before me, it needs to be recorded. Not confessed, because I don't know if I'm sorry enough for that. But recorded, so someone knows. So the land remembers even if people forget. The Hartwell Farm wasn't always ours. Before us, this land belonged to the Morrison family. Daniel Morrison homesteaded these 100 acres in 1889, built the original farmhouse, cleared the field stone by stone, planted the first crops. His son, Thomas Morrison, inherited it in 1923. Thomas had 2 daughters, no sons. The eldest daughter, Margaret, married a man named William Chin in 1941. That's when everything changed. Emma read those words 3 times, her mind struggling to process what they meant. The Morrison family. The lawyer handling Howard's estate was named Gerald Morrison. Was that a coincidence? And a Chinese son-in-law in 1941 Nebraska, that wouldn't have been welcomed in a place and time where difference meant danger. She continued reading, and the story that emerged made her stomach turn. William Chin was second-generation American, his parents having immigrated from Guangdong province in the 1890s. He'd grown up in San Francisco, earned a degree in agricultural science from UC Davis, and came to Nebraska to work for the Agricultural Extension Service. He met Margaret Morrison at a county fair where he was giving a presentation on new irrigation techniques. They fell in love despite her father's objections, despite the whispers in town, despite the fact that Nebraska in 1941 wasn't kind to mixed-race couples. Thomas Morrison had refused to attend their wedding. When they returned to the farm to try and make peace, he'd ordered them off the property and told Margaret she was no longer his daughter. William and Margaret had moved into town, rented a small house, and William had taken whatever work he could find, mostly manual labor, despite his education, because nobody would hire a Chinese man for professional work. Then Pearl Harbor happened. And everything got worse. Howard's handwriting grew tighter, more compressed, as if the words were being forced through a narrowing space. After Pearl Harbor, people in town stopped pretending to be civil. It didn't matter that William was American, that his family had been here for 2 generations, that he'd never even been to China. He looked like the enemy, and that was enough. Someone painted slurs on their house. The landlord evicted them. William lost his job at the feed store where he'd been working. Thomas Morrison still wouldn't speak to his daughter. But my father, James Hartwell, he saw an opportunity. Dad owned the property adjacent to the Morrison farm. 80 acres of good land, but he'd always wanted more. He'd made offers to Thomas Morrison over the years, but Morrison wouldn't sell. The land was meant for his daughters, for their children, to keep the Morrison name attached to the soil. But now Thomas had a problem. Margaret was still legally his heir, and she was married to a man the whole county had turned against. Dad saw that problem and knew how to exploit it. Emma set the journal down for a moment, her hands shaking. She walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water from the tap, drank it standing at the sink while staring out the window at the dark fields. The weight of what she was reading pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She returned to the hidden room and continued reading. In March 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Japanese Americans on the West Coast were being rounded up and sent to internment camps. The order didn't technically apply to Nebraska, we were too far inland, but the fear was spreading. People whispered that it was only a matter of time before all Asians would be rounded up, Japanese or not. The government didn't care about the difference. William and Margaret were desperate. They had nowhere to live, no income, and a baby on the way. Margaret went to her father and begged him for help. Not for the farm, just for shelter. A place to stay until things calmed down. Thomas Morrison was a hard man, but he wasn't heartless. He agreed to let them stay in the old tenant house on the back 40 acres. It wasn't much, barely more than a shack, but it had a roof and walls. William and Margaret moved in and William started working the Morrison land in exchange for housing. He was good at it too, according to Dad. Better than Thomas had ever been. William's education in agricultural science meant he understood crop rotation, soil conservation, modern techniques that most farmers around here had never heard of. But that spring, someone burned a cross in their yard. Someone else shot out the windows of the tenant house while Margaret was inside, 7 months pregnant. The sheriff came by, asked some questions, but nobody was ever arrested. The message was clear, you're not wanted here. That's when my father made his move. Emma's throat was tight as she turned the page. Dad went to Thomas Morrison with a proposal. He'd buy the Morrison farm at a fair price, enough for Thomas to retire comfortably. Thomas could move to town, away from the trouble his daughter had brought to his doorstep. And Dad would take care of the Williamson problem. He had connections with people who could make sure William was sent away somewhere safe, maybe one of the internment camps where at least he'd be protected from local violence, or maybe out of state entirely. One way or another, William would be gone, and Margaret could come back to the family, raise her baby with her maiden name, let people forget about her mistake. Thomas Morrison was 73 years old and tired. Tired of farming, tired of the gossip, tired of watching his daughter suffer for her choices. He agreed to the sale. The paperwork was drawn up. The Morrison farm would become part of the Hartwell holdings for $20,000, about half what it was actually worth. But there was a problem. Margaret was still Thomas's legal heir. She had to sign documents relinquishing her claim to the property. And Margaret, pregnant and terrified as she was, refused. She knew what my father was planning. She knew that once the land was sold, once she had no leverage, William would disappear. Maybe to a camp, maybe to something worse. She'd heard the stories about Chinese men who'd gone missing, found dead in ditches, victims of patriotic violence that no one investigated too closely. So she refused to sign. And my father, God help him, he found another way. Emma realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly and kept reading. On the night of July 17, 1942, the tenant house caught fire. Margaret was 9 months pregnant. William was in town trying to find work. By the time anyone saw the flames and got there to help, it was too late. Margaret died in that fire. So did her unborn baby. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Faulty kerosene heater, he said. These old houses, they go up like tinder. Real tragedy. But there were people who whispered about what they'd seen that night. A truck parked on the road nearby. Men walking away from the property just before the fire started. Nobody who would testify to it, but enough talk that my father paid the sheriff a visit and made sure the investigation closed quickly. William Chen came back from town to find his wife and child dead, his home burned to the foundation. He tried to press charges. Tried to get the sheriff to investigate. But he was a Chinese man in 1942 Nebraska accusing white men of murder. Nobody would listen. Nobody cared. 3 days after the fire, William disappeared. The official story was that he'd left town, overcome with grief. But Dad came home late that night with dirt under his fingernails and wouldn't look anyone in the eye for weeks after. I was 12 years old. I didn't understand then. I understand now. With Margaret dead and William gone, there was no one to contest the sale. Thomas Morrison signed over his land to my father for $20,000 and moved into a boarding house in town. He died 6 months later. Heart attack, the doctor said. But I think he died of shame. The Morrison farm became Hartwell land. Dad combined it with his own 80 acres and had himself a real operation. Over the next 20 years, he bought up 3 more neighboring properties and built the Hartwell Farm into one of the most successful operations in the county. When he died in 1967, he left it all to me. 180 acres of productive farmland and a bank account with $200,000. I was 37 years old. I had a wife and 2 young children. I had opportunities my father never had. And I had land that was bought with murder. Emma closed the journal and leaned back against the wall, her mind reeling. The Hartwell Farm's success, the family's wealth, her grandfather's comfortable retirement, it was all built on stolen land and covered-up violence. The foundation of everything she believed about her family was rotten. She looked around the hidden room with new understanding. This wasn't just a storage space. This was a monument to guilt, evidence carefully preserved by a man who'd spent his entire adult life living with the knowledge of how his prosperity had been purchased. But why had Howard kept it secret? Why hadn't he tried to make it right? Emma opened the journal again and continued reading. The entries jumped forward in time, no longer daily but periodic, written whenever the weight of knowledge became too heavy to carry silently. August 1973. I tried to find William Chen today. Spent 3 weeks tracking down records, making phone calls, visiting county offices in 3 states. I found a death certificate. William Chen died January 1943 in a county hospital in Iowa. Cause of death listed as pneumonia, but the attending physician noted severe injuries consistent with a beating. He'd been found half frozen in a ditch beside a rural highway. Nobody claimed the body. He was buried in a pauper's grave. I know what happened. Dad and his friends, they didn't just run William out of town. They made sure he wouldn't come back. Made sure he wouldn't talk. Made sure the Morrison land would stay Hartwell land forever. I've been running this farm for 6 years now. Making good money. Catherine is in college. Everything we have is tainted with blood and I don't know how to clean it. September 1985. I hired a private investigator to search for any surviving Chen family members. Found William's brother in San Francisco. Robert Chen, age 74, living in a small apartment in Chinatown. I wrote him a letter trying to explain what had happened, trying to ask what I could do to make amends. He wrote back one line, "Your family took everything. There is no amends for that. Don't contact me again." He's right. What could I offer that would matter? Money? The land itself? It wouldn't bring back William or Margaret or their baby. It wouldn't undo 70 years of prosperity built on their graves. March 1995. Thomas Morrison's granddaughter came to see me today. Gerald Morrison, the lawyer in town, he's Margaret's cousin. He knows the family history, knows what really happened even if it was never proven. His daughter married a historian, and they've been researching the Morrison family tree. They know about Margaret and William. They know the land should have gone to Margaret's heirs if she'd lived. Gerald didn't come to make accusations. He came to ask if I had any information about what happened to the baby's remains. Margaret was buried in the town cemetery, but there's no grave for the child. He wanted to know if I knew where the baby was laid to rest. I couldn't tell him the truth. That the fire was so hot there was nothing left to bury separately. That my father made sure of that. So I lied and said I didn't know. And I saw in Gerald's eyes that he knew I was lying, but he didn't push. Just thanked me quietly and left. I'm 75 years old and I've been carrying this weight for 53 years. It's crushing me. Emma found photographs in one of the boxes. Grainy black and white images that showed the Morrison farmhouse before it became the Hartwell Farmhouse. A young couple standing in front of a tenant house, the woman clearly pregnant, the man's hand protectively on her shoulder. Margaret and William, she realized. Young and in love and doomed. There were newspaper clippings about the fire, about Margaret's death, about William's disappearance. There were letters from Robert Chen, William's brother, rejecting Howard's attempts at contact and reconciliation. There were legal documents showing the transfer of property from Morrison to Hartwell, the signatures shaky, the ink official. And there were deed records, going back to 1889, showing the complete chain of ownership. The Morrison family had owned this land for 53 years before James Hartwell acquired it through what amounted to theft and murder. Emma spent hours going through everything, piecing together the complete story. What emerged was a portrait of her grandfather as a man who'd inherited both prosperity and guilt, who'd tried repeatedly to make amends but had never found the courage to actually give back what had been stolen. He'd offered money to the Chen family, they'd refused. He'd tried to establish scholarships in Margaret and William's names, the university had questions he couldn't answer without exposing the truth. He'd even drafted a will leaving the farm to the Morrison descendants, but he'd never signed it, never made it official, never actually relinquished control. The final journal entry was dated just 3 months before Howard's death. December 2023. I'm dying. Doctor says my heart is giving out. Maybe 6 months if I'm lucky. I've had 87 years on this earth and I've spent most of them as a coward. I'm leaving the farm to Emma. Not because she deserves the burden, but because she's the only one in the family who might have the courage I never had. Catherine ran away from this place and never looked back. Marcus sees land as nothing more than a commodity. But Emma, she understands that land remembers. That soil holds history. That you can't just pave over the past and pretend it never happened. I'm leaving her this room, these documents, the truth. And I'm leaving her a choice. She can do what I should have done 70 years ago. She can give the land back to who it belongs to. Or she can keep it, sell it, profit from it like I did. Either way, she'll have to live with the decision. I hope she's stronger than I was. I hope she chooses better than I did. And I hope that Margaret and William and their baby can someday forgive what my family did to them. Emma sat on the floor of the hidden room, surrounded by evidence of sins she hadn't committed but had benefited from her entire life. Every childhood summer spent on this farm, every college tuition payment her grandfather had helped with, every dollar in the trust fund he'd left her, it was all built on theft and violence and covered-up murder. The farm was worth nearly $2 million, even drowning in debt. The land itself, if sold to one of the corporate agricultural companies, would bring in enough to pay off everything and leave substantial money left over. Money that came from property that should never have been Howard Hartwell's to sell. Emma's phone buzzed. A text from her mother. Have you made a decision about the farm? The bank needs an answer soon. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. Sentiment. As if this was about nostalgia for childhood summers and not about a legacy built on unmarked graves. Emma stood and walked out of the hidden room, through the house, onto the front porch. The August night was cooling off, a breeze moving through the corn stalks with a sound like whispered secrets. The land stretched out before her, dark and vast and complicated. She thought about Margaret Morrison Chen, 22 years old and 9 months pregnant, burning to death in a tenant house while men her father-in-law had hired made sure she couldn't escape. She thought about William Chen, beaten and left to die in an Iowa ditch, buried in an unmarked grave without even his brother knowing where to mourn him. She thought about a baby who never drew breath, whose remains were scattered in ashes because it was more convenient that way. And she thought about Howard Hartwell, carrying that knowledge for 60 years, maintaining this elaborate archive of guilt but never actually doing anything to make it right. Wanting absolution but not enough to pay the price for it. Emma pulled out her phone and opened the browser. She searched for Gerald Morrison, attorney at law, Copper Ridge, Nebraska. Found his office number and his personal cell phone listed on his firm's website. It was 10:30 at night, too late to call. But Emma called anyway. Gerald Morrison answered on the third ring, his voice alert despite the hour. Gerald Morrison. Mr. Morrison, this is Emma Hartwell. Howard Hartwell's granddaughter. I'm calling because I found something at the farm. Something you need to see. Something about your family. There was a long pause. Then, carefully, what kind of something, Miss Hartwell? The truth about what happened to Margaret Morrison and William Chen. About how my family got this land. About where the money came from. Emma's voice was steady now, certain. And I think you need to help me figure out how to give it back. Another pause, longer this time. Emma could hear Gerald breathing on the other end, could almost feel him making calculations, weighing possibilities. I'll be there first thing in the morning, he finally said. Don't touch anything. Don't show this to anyone else. And Miss Hartwell, thank you. After hanging up, Emma sat on the porch steps and waited for sunrise. She didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know if returning the land was even legally possible after 80 years. Didn't know how her mother and brother would react when they found out she was giving away a $2 million inheritance. Didn't know if the Morrison and Chen descendants would even want the land back or if they'd prefer some other form of restitution. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't keeping property bought with murder. She wasn't building her life on that foundation. Whatever it cost her, whatever consequences came from this decision, she would do what her grandfather should have done 60 years ago. The land remembered. And Emma Hartwell was done pretending it didn't. Gerald Morrison arrived at 7 the next morning, driving a dusty pickup truck that had seen better decades. He was in his late 60s, Emma realized, though she'd only ever seen him in suits at the lawyer's office. Today he wore jeans and a faded work shirt, looking more like a farmer than an attorney. His eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting he hadn't slept any better than she had. Emma led him to the hidden room without preamble. She'd spent the hours before dawn organizing the materials, creating a timeline of documents and photographs that told the story chronologically. She wanted him to see it all at once, to understand the complete scope of what had been hidden for 8 decades. Gerald stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking. Then he stepped inside and began reading. Emma watched his face as he went through the journal entries, the photographs, the newspaper clippings. She saw grief there, and anger, but also something that looked like relief. As if a question that had haunted his family for generations was finally being answered. My grandmother used to tell stories about Aunt Margaret, Gerald said quietly, his finger tracing the edge of a photograph showing Margaret and William standing together. She was only 8 when Margaret died, but she remembered her. Said Margaret was the kindest person she'd ever known. Said she had a laugh that sounded like music. He looked up at Emma. My grandmother also said the fire wasn't an accident. She was just a child, but she remembered her father, Margaret's uncle, saying things didn't add up. The kerosene heater was new, professionally installed. The doors were jammed from the outside. But nobody would investigate. Nobody cared enough about a Chinese man's wife to ask hard questions. Emma nodded. My grandfather knew. He was 12 when it happened. Old enough to understand what his father had done, young enough that nobody thought to hide it from him completely. He spent the rest of his life carrying that knowledge. But not doing anything about it, Gerald said, and there was steel in his voice now. No. Not doing anything about it. Emma met his eyes. Which is why I called you. I want to know what we can do to make this right. I don't expect it to undo what happened. Nothing can bring Margaret and William and their baby back. But I can't keep this land. I can't profit from what my family did. Gerald set down the photograph he'd been holding and looked at Emma with an expression she couldn't quite read. Do you understand what you're saying? The farm is worth close to $2 million. Even with the debts, you're talking about walking away from substantial money. Your inheritance. An inheritance bought with murder. Emma's voice was firm. I understand exactly what I'm saying. I want to find Margaret and William's surviving family members and return what was stolen from them. The land, or the value of the land, or whatever form of restitution they'd prefer. However this works legally, I want it done right. Gerald walked around the room slowly, taking in the scope of Howard's archive. Your grandfather contacted my office several times over the years. He'd ask questions about property transfers, about wills, about how to leave assets to people who weren't direct heirs. I always wondered what he was planning. Now I know. He turned back to Emma. He was trying to figure out how to give it back without admitting what his father had done. Trying to find a way to ease his conscience without facing consequences. That's about the size of it. You're braver than he was. I don't know about that. Emma looked at the journal, at her grandfather's careful handwriting documenting decades of cowardice and guilt. I just know I can't live the way he did. I can't spend the rest of my life knowing where this money came from and pretending it doesn't matter. Gerald pulled out his phone and made a call. Robert? It's Gerald Morrison. I need you to come to the Hartwell Farm. Now. Yes, I know it's Saturday. This is important. Family important. He listened for a moment. Trust me. You need to see this. While they waited, Gerald explained that Robert Morrison Chen, named for both his grandfather Robert Chen and his great-aunt Margaret Morrison, was a history professor at the University of Nebraska. He was 53 years old, the grandson of William Chen's younger brother. He'd grown up hearing family stories about the great-uncle who'd disappeared in Nebraska, about the wife who'd burned to death, about land that should have been family property. Roberts spent 20 years researching what happened, Gerald said. He's filed Freedom of Information requests, dug through county records, interviewed anyone who remembered the 1940s. He knows most of the story already. What he doesn't have is proof. Your grandfather's archive, that's the proof. Robert Chen arrived 40 minutes later, driving a sedan with university parking stickers. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and his great-uncle's cheekbones. Emma could see William Chen in his face, in the way he held himself, and the recognition made her chest tight. Gerald made introductions. Robert, this is Emma Hartwell. Howard Hartwell's granddaughter. Emma, Robert Morrison Chen. He's Margaret's cousin's grandson and William Chen's great-nephew. Robert's handshake was firm, his expression guarded. Mr. Morrison said this was about family history. I have to say, I'm surprised to be meeting with a Hartwell. Your family hasn't been particularly cooperative with my research over the years. I found something, Emma said simply. Something my grandfather kept hidden. Something you need to see. She showed him into the room and watched as he took in the archive. His expression shifted from skepticism to shock to something close to devastation as he began reading through the documents. His hands shook when he picked up the photograph of William and Margaret. I've been looking for a picture of them together for 15 years, he said, his voice rough. The family lost everything when William died. There are photographs of William as a child in San Francisco, and one of Margaret from high school, but nothing of them together. Nothing that proved they existed as a couple, as people who loved each other. He looked at Emma with tears in his eyes. Thank you for this. Whatever else happens, thank you for letting me see this. The three of them spent the next 2 hours going through everything. Robert took photographs of documents with his phone, made notes, asked questions that Emma answered as honestly as she could. Gerald took legal pads from his briefcase and began making lists, documenting what would be needed to build a case for restitution. The land transfer was legal on paper, Gerald finally said. Thomas Morrison sold the property to James Hartwell. That's documented and notarized. What wasn't legal was the arson and murder that forced the sale. But proving that 80 years later, when everyone involved is dead, that's going to be complicated. We have Howard's confession, Emma pointed out. His journal documents everything his father told him, everything he witnessed. A confession from a man who's dead, about crimes committed by another dead man. Gerald shook his head. It's evidence, but it's not the same as testimony. We'd need to pursue this through civil court, wrongful death claims, that kind of thing. Even then, statutes of limitations become an issue. Robert set down the journal he'd been reading. I don't want to sue anyone. I don't want years of legal battles and media attention and fighting over money. He looked at Emma. What I want is for people to know what happened. I want Margaret and William's story told. I want their names on something permanent, not just buried in family whispers and sealed records. And I want my family to have some connection to the land that should have been ours. Emma felt something unlock in her chest. What if we made the farm into something that honored them? Not just gave it back, but transformed it into something meaningful? What do you mean? Robert asked. The idea was forming even as she spoke. What if we turned the farm into an agricultural education center? Named it for Margaret Morrison Chen and William Chen. We could offer training programs for immigrant farmers, for people who've been shut out of agricultural opportunities because of their race or background. We could document what happened here, create a memorial, make sure this history isn't forgotten. And we could operate it as a non-profit, so it serves the community instead of just generating profit for one family. Gerald was nodding slowly. That could work. We'd need to restructure the debt, find funding, but it's legally viable. You'd essentially be donating the property to a charitable trust with specific educational and memorial purposes. My great-uncle was an agricultural scientist, Robert said quietly. He came here to help farmers improve their techniques, to share knowledge. He was killed for it. If this place could become somewhere that actually does what he wanted to do, where people who look like him aren't driven away but welcomed and taught and given opportunities, his voice broke. That would mean something. That would be worth more than any amount of money. They talked for hours, sketching out possibilities. Emma would work with Robert and Gerald to establish a non-profit foundation. The farm would be transferred to the foundation's ownership. They'd need to fundraise to cover the existing debts and operating costs, but Gerald knew grant programs that funded agricultural education. Robert had connections at the university, professors who might be interested in partnering with the project. The house could be restored and turned into a teaching facility. The workshop could become classrooms. The fields could be demonstration plots where new farming techniques were tested and taught. And some were visible, some were permanent. There would be a memorial telling the truth about what had happened here. I'll need to talk to my mother and brother, Emma said. They're not going to be happy about giving away their inheritance. Are you prepared for that fight? Gerald asked. Emma thought about Margaret burning to death while men stood outside and made sure she couldn't escape. She thought about William beaten and left to freeze in a ditch. She thought about a baby who never had a chance to draw breath. Yes. I'm prepared. Catherine Hartwell arrived in Copper Ridge 3 days later, driving up from Chicago in a luxury sedan that looked absurdly out of place on the gravel farm roads. She wore a cream-colored suit and sunglasses that probably cost more than a month's worth of groceries, and her expression when she walked into the farmhouse suggested she'd smelled something unpleasant. Emma, what is this about? Your message said it was urgent, that it couldn't be discussed over the phone. I canceled meetings to drive out here. Emma had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed what she'd say, but now that her mother stood in front of her, all the careful speeches evaporated. She just gestured toward the hidden room. I found something. Something Grandpa kept secret. Something that changes everything. She showed Catherine the archive, handed her the journal, watched her mother's face as she read. Catherine's expression shifted from impatience to confusion to horror to anger in the space of minutes. This is insane, Catherine said flatly, setting down the journal. Dad wrote this when he was old, probably confused. You can't possibly believe, there are photographs. documents, corroboration from other sources. It's all true, Mom. Grandpa's father killed Margaret Morrison Chen and her baby, and probably William Chen too. He stole this land. Everything we have came from that. Catherine's face had gone pale. Even if this is true, and I'm not saying it is, but even if it is, it happened 80 years ago. Everyone involved is dead. There's nothing to be done about it now. I'm giving the land back, Emma said quietly. I'm working with the Morrison and Chen families to establish a foundation. The farm will become an agricultural education center named for Margaret and William. It'll serve immigrant farmers, people of color, people who've been excluded from opportunities. It'll tell the truth about what happened here. Absolutely not. Catherine's voice was ice. You don't have the authority to make that decision. This is a family estate. Marcus and I have interests in this property too. The will left the farm to me, Emma said. Grandpa made me sole owner. You and Marcus got money. I got the land and the decision about what to do with it. So you're just going to throw away $2 million? Money that could secure your future, that could be split among the family? You're going to give it all away to salve your conscience about something that happened before you were born? I'm going to do what Grandpa should have done 60 years ago. What your grandfather should have never allowed to happen in the first place. Catherine stared at her daughter with an expression Emma had never seen before. Something between fury and fear and desperate incomprehension. Do you have any idea what you're doing? The scandal this will cause? The shame it will bring on the family name? The family name was built on murder, Mom. I think it's okay if it gets a little tarnished. You self-righteous, Catherine stopped herself, breathing hard. This is because you never fit in anywhere else, isn't it? You couldn't make it in the real world, so you're running back to this farm and playing hero. This is about you needing to feel special, to feel like you matter. The words hit harder than Emma expected. She'd known her mother would be angry, but this personal viciousness was something else. This isn't about me. This is about doing what's right. Right according to who? Some modern morality that didn't exist in 1942? My grandfather did what he had to do to survive, to build something, to give his family opportunities. Yes, it was harsh. Yes, people got hurt. That's how the world worked back then. You don't get to judge from your comfortable 21st century perspective. I absolutely do get to judge. And so does history. And so do the people whose family members were murdered. Catherine grabbed her purse, her movements sharp and angry. If you do this, you're on your own. Don't expect support from me or Marcus. Don't expect help when this foundation fails and you're left with nothing. You're throwing away your family for strangers who've been dead for 80 years. I'm honoring the people my family wronged. There's a difference. Her mother left without another word, the door slamming behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. Emma stood in the empty house and allowed herself to cry. Not because she regretted her decision, but because it hurt to be rejected by her own mother for doing what was right. Because she was truly alone now in a way she'd never been before. But when the tears stopped, she got back to work. The next 3 months were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and planning. Gerald Morrison proved invaluable, navigating the legal complexities of establishing the foundation and transferring the property. Robert Chin became a partner in every sense, helping design the educational programs, reaching out to agricultural organizations, building the framework for what the center would become. They found allies in unexpected places. A coalition of immigrant farmer groups in Nebraska offered support and expertise. The university's agricultural department committed to partnering with the Center for Research and Teaching. A grant from the Department of Agriculture provided initial funding. Slowly, impossibly, the vision started becoming real. They held a community meeting in September to announce the project. Emma had been dreading it, expecting hostility or skepticism from a town that had spent 80 years believing one version of history. But the reaction surprised her. Some people were defensive, yes. Some insisted the past should stay buried. But others, especially older residents who remembered hearing whispers about what really happened, seemed relieved that the truth was finally being acknowledged. Several people approached Emma after the meeting to share their own family stories of prejudice and violence during the war years, of Japanese-American neighbors who'd been driven away, of Chinese railroad workers who'd been cheated and abused. "This town has ghosts," one elderly woman told Emma. "It's about time we started naming them." The memorial was dedicated on a cold November afternoon. They'd chosen the site carefully, the spot where the tenant house had stood before it burned, where Margaret and William had tried to build a life together. A stone marker now stood there, engraved with their names and their story, with a photograph laser-etched into granite showing them young and in love and full of hope. Robertson stood in front of the memorial with tears streaming down his face, surrounded by family members who'd driven in from California and Oregon and Washington. Emma stood beside him, and Gerald Morrison stood on his other side, 3 families bound together by tragedy and the slow work of reconciliation. "This doesn't undo what happened," Robert said when it was his turn to speak. "Nothing can bring Margaret and William and their baby back. Nothing can give them the lives they should have had. But this," he gestured at the memorial, at the restored farmhouse behind them, at the fields stretching toward the horizon, "this says their lives mattered. Their story matters. And the land remembers them now, officially and permanently." Emma spoke last, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd of maybe 200 people. "My grandfather spent 60 years carrying the weight of what his father had done. He wanted to make it right, but he was too afraid. Too worried about consequences, about family reputation, about losing what had been stolen for him. I understand that fear. Giving up this inheritance, alienating my family, exposing the truth, none of it's been easy. But my grandfather left me a choice. And I chose to believe that justice delayed is better than justice denied forever. I chose to believe that land can be healed, that stories can be told, that we can honor the dead by creating something meaningful from their loss." After the ceremony, people lingered, talking in small groups, examining the memorial, touring the farmhouse that was being converted into classrooms. Emma found herself standing alone at the edge of the crowd, looking out at the fields. The farm looked different now. Not in any physical way, the same fields, the same horizon, the same Nebraska sky stretching overhead. But it felt different. Lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the soil itself. Gerald Morrison walked over to stand beside her. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said quietly. "I don't know about that. He had 60 years to do this and never found the courage. Maybe. Or maybe he was waiting for someone like you. Someone who could do what he couldn't." Gerald smiled. "Either way, you've done something remarkable here, Emma. You've turned a legacy of shame into something that will help people for generations." Emma thought about that. About how the farm would operate now, teaching sustainable agriculture to immigrant families, creating opportunities for people who'd been excluded from farming. About how Margaret and William's names would be spoken here regularly, their story taught to every student who came through the programs. About how the land that had been stolen from them would now serve the exact communities they'd represented. "It still doesn't feel like enough," she said. "It never does. But it's something. And something is better than silence." As winter settled over Nebraska and the first snow began to fall, Emma moved into the small apartment they'd created in the farmhouse for the center's director, a position she'd accepted after much deliberation. She'd left her job in Portland, left her comfortable urban life, committed herself to this place and its complicated history. Some nights she sat in the office, no longer hidden, its walls torn down to make it part of the main teaching space, and read through her grandfather's journal again. She understood him better now, understood the paralysis that came from knowing you should do something but being terrified of the cost. Understood how easy it was to convince yourself that staying silent was protecting people you loved, when really it was just protecting yourself from difficult choices. But she also understood that silence had its own cost. That carrying the weight of hidden wrongs didn't make you noble, just complicit. That true courage meant facing consequences instead of avoiding them. The farm's first students would arrive in spring, 20 immigrant farmers from 7 different countries, here to learn techniques that would help them succeed in American agriculture. Emma had helped design the curriculum, working with Robert and the university professors to create something practical and meaningful. On clear nights, Emma walked out to the memorial and stood in the cold, looking at the names carved in stone. Margaret Morrison Chen. William Chen. Baby Chen, born and died July 17, 1942. The land remembered now. And Emma Hartwell was making sure it never forgot. Spring arrived late that year, the ground holding winter's frost longer than usual, reluctant to wake. Emma stood at the window of what had once been her grandfather's office, watching the first green shoots push through the dark soil in the demonstration fields. 20 students would arrive in 2 weeks, their applications already processed, their housing arranged in the converted outbuildings. The Margaret and William Chen Agricultural Education Center was about to fulfill the purpose it had been created for. She'd been living at the farm for 4 months now, long enough to understand its rhythms in a way she never had during childhood summers. Long enough to know which boards on the porch creaked underfoot, which windows stuck in their frames, which sections of fence line needed the most attention. The land was teaching her, the way it had taught her grandfather, the way it had taught all the Hartwells before him. The difference was that now she was listening to what it was actually saying instead of what she wanted to hear. Robert Chen had become a regular presence, driving out from Lincoln every few weeks to check on the center's progress. He'd donated his entire collection of research materials about Margaret and William to the center's archive, boxes of documents and photographs that now filled the shelves where Howard's guilty secrets had once been stored. The room was no longer hidden, its walls removed during renovation to make it part of the main building's flow. Sunlight reached places that had been dark for decades. "I brought something," Robert said during his visit in early April, pulling a small wooden box from his bag. "My grandmother kept it all these years. She died last month at 97. In her will, she asked that this be brought here." Inside the box was a jade pendant on a thin gold chain, delicate and clearly old. "It belonged to William's mother," Robert explained. "She gave it to him when he left San Francisco, told him it would keep him safe. He gave it to Margaret when they got married. My grandmother, William's sister-in-law, she found it in Margaret's things after the fire. She'd been wearing it when she died." Robert's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he lifted the pendant. "My grandmother said it should come back to this land. That Margaret would want it here, where their story is finally being told truthfully." They placed it in a display case in the main hall, next to photographs of Margaret and William, next to copies of the documents that told their story. The pendant caught the light, casting small rainbows across the wall. Emma found herself stopping to look at it often, thinking about Margaret putting it on that last morning, not knowing it would be the last piece of beauty she'd ever wear. The restoration work on the farmhouse had revealed other secrets, though none as dark as what Howard had kept hidden. They'd found letters tucked between wall studs, love notes that Thomas Morrison had written to his wife in the 1920s. They'd found children's drawings scratched into the wooden beams of the attic, dated 1897. They'd found newspaper clippings about the farm's early years, when it had been a stopping point on a rural mail route. The house held layers of history, generations of lives lived within its walls, and the renovation team had been careful to preserve and document everything they found. Gerald Morrison had taken to visiting regularly too, bringing his own family history to add to the center's growing archive. He'd found court records showing that his grandfather, Margaret's uncle, had tried to press for a proper investigation into the fire. The case had been shut down after 3 days, the sheriff's report filed with minimal detail, the whole matter quietly buried. Gerald's grandfather had written angry letters to the governor, to state police, to anyone who might listen. None of it had mattered. Justice in 1942 Nebraska wasn't available to Chinese men or the white women who loved them. My grandfather died angry, Gerald told Emma one afternoon as they sorted through old documents in the archive room. He knew what had happened. He knew who was responsible. But he couldn't prove it, and nobody in power cared enough to help him try. He told my father that the land itself would remember, even if people forgot. That someday the truth would come out. Gerald looked around the room, at the carefully organized history now available for anyone to see. I think he'd be satisfied with this. Not happy, how could anyone be happy about what happened? But satisfied that the silence finally ended. Emma's mother had not returned to Nebraska, had not spoken to her daughter since that angry confrontation in September. But Marcus had called, surprisingly, 2 weeks after the memorial dedication. His voice on the phone had been stiff, formal, but not hostile. "I saw the news coverage," he'd said. "About the center, about what you're doing there. About the family history." Emma had braced herself for criticism, for another lecture about throwing away the inheritance, about bringing shame on the family name. Instead, Marcus had said, "I think I owe you an apology. I've been thinking about it a lot. About how I reacted, about what I said. I was angry because you were disrupting my understanding of who we were, where we came from. It's easier to believe in simple stories. Good grandparents who worked hard and built something from nothing. Harder to accept that the foundation was rotten." "You don't have to apologize for being shocked," Emma had said carefully. "I was shocked too when I found it. But I should have supported you. You were doing the right thing, the hard thing, and I made it harder because I was worried about money and reputation. That was wrong." He'd paused. "I'd like to come visit sometime. See what you've built. Meet the people you're working with. If that's okay." Marcus had come the following month, spending 3 days at the farm. He'd been awkward at first, clearly out of his element in work boots and jeans, but he'd listened as Emma and Robert explained the center's mission. He'd stood quietly at the memorial, reading the inscription over and over. And before he left, he'd written a check to the foundation, a substantial donation that would fund scholarships for students who couldn't afford the program fees. "It doesn't fix anything," he'd said as he handed Emma the check. "But maybe it's a start. Maybe it's what Grandpa should have done instead of just feeling guilty." The first class of students arrived on a Monday in late April, their vehicles pulling into the gravel parking area in a convoy of trucks and old sedans loaded with belongings. They came from Mexico, from Guatemala, from Vietnam and Somalia and Burma. They'd been farming in their home countries, or they were children of farmers trying to establish themselves in America, or they were refugees who'd worked in agriculture before displacement forced them to start over in a new land. Emma met each of them personally, shaking hands, helping carry boxes, showing them to their housing in the renovated outbuildings that had once stored equipment. She saw in their faces the same cautious hope she remembered from her own first days at the farm, the same uncertainty about whether this place would welcome them or reject them. During the welcome dinner that first evening, Robert Chin gave a speech about the center's history and purpose. He told Margaret and William's story simply and honestly, not hiding the violence or the injustice, but also not dwelling on it. He spoke about how agriculture had always been built by immigrant labor, by people from every corner of the world bringing their knowledge and traditions to new soil. He spoke about how this land had once rejected his great-uncle for the color of his skin, and how it was now dedicated to ensuring that rejection never happened again. "This place remembers," Robert said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "The land remembers who worked it, who loved it, who died for it. And now it remembers Margaret and William not just as victims, but as the reason this center exists. Every person who learns here, every family who gets their start in American agriculture because of the training you'll receive, you're part of their legacy too. You're what they would have wanted. You're the future they never got to see." The students began their work the next morning, spreading across the demonstration fields to learn soil testing, irrigation management, crop rotation techniques. Emma watched them from the porch, coffee cup in hand, and felt something settle in her chest. This was what the land was supposed to be, a place of growth and learning, of opportunities given rather than stolen. She'd hired staff carefully, building a team that reflected the communities they served. The lead instructor was a second-generation Mexican immigrant who'd built a successful organic farm outside Omaha. The soil scientist was a woman from the Philippines with a doctorate from Iowa State. The business management teacher was a Somali refugee who'd established a cooperative farming network that served East African immigrants across 3 states. Together they created an environment where students could see themselves reflected in their teachers, where success felt possible because others who looked like them had already achieved it. Through the growing season, Emma found herself falling into rhythms she hadn't known she needed. Early mornings checking the fields with the students, afternoons in the classroom or the office handling administrative work, evenings on the porch watching the sun set over land that was finally serving the purpose it should have served all along. Gerald Morrison brought his granddaughter to visit in June, a serious 12-year-old named Margaret, named for the great-great-aunt she'd never known but whose story had become central to the family's understanding of itself. Young Margaret walked through the center with wide eyes, touching the memorial stone gently, studying the photographs in the display cases, asking questions that showed she'd been thinking deeply about justice and memory and what it meant to inherit complicated history. "Is it weird living here?" she asked Emma. "Knowing what your family did?" Emma considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. I think about it every day. But I also think that's appropriate. This place shouldn't be comfortable for me. The discomfort is part of what keeps me honest about why the center exists and who it's supposed to serve." "My dad says you gave up a lot of money to do this," Margaret said. "I gave up money I never should have had. That's different than giving up something that was rightfully mine." The girl thought about that, then nodded. "I think what you did was brave." "I think what was brave was Margaret Morrison marrying the man she loved even when everyone told her it was wrong. I'm just trying to honor that courage instead of profiting from the people who tried to destroy it." Summer brought the first harvest from the demonstration plots, small yields but successful ones that proved the teaching methods worked. The students who'd arrived uncertain and hesitant in April were confident now, moving through the fields with the ease of people who understood what they were doing. Several had already secured leases on farmland for the following season, ready to start their own operations with the knowledge and connections they'd gained. On the last evening before the first class graduated, Emma stood with Robert Chin at the memorial as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that matched the ripening corn. "Do you think they'd be proud?" Emma asked. "Margaret and William. Do you think this is what they would have wanted?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "I think Margaret would be amazed that her name is remembered at all, that her story is told. Women like her, immigrants like William, they were supposed to disappear. History wasn't supposed to record them except as footnotes, if that. The fact that this place exists, that their names are carved in stone, that people learn their story, yes, I think she'd be proud of that." "And William?" "William was a scientist. He believed in sharing knowledge, in teaching, in making agriculture better for everyone. This center does exactly what he spent his life trying to do." Robert smiled. "I think he'd be satisfied. Maybe even happy, if ghosts can be happy. At least his death wasn't meaningless. At least something grew from it." They stood together as darkness fell, two people bound by history they hadn't created but had chosen to honor. The land stretched around them, the same soil that had witnessed violence and silence, now witnessing healing and truth. It wasn't redemption, some things were too big for redemption. But it was remembrance, and acknowledgement, and the slow work of turning inherited shame into something useful. Emma's mother never did come back to Nebraska, never reconciled with her daughter's choice. But she stopped trying to change Emma's mind, stopped sending angry emails about squandered inheritance. The silence between them was cold but no longer hostile. Perhaps that was the best they could manage. Some bridges burned too thoroughly to rebuild, and Emma had made peace with that. The center grew over the following years, adding new programs and serving more students. They established partnerships with immigrant community organizations across the Midwest, created scholarship funds, built greenhouse facilities for year-round teaching. The demonstration fields became some of the most productive in the county, proving that sustainable practices could compete with industrial agriculture when given proper support and education. Emma remained as director, her landscape architecture career abandoned permanently for this work that felt like calling rather than job. She dated occasionally, but never seriously, too consumed by the center's mission to build room for much else in her life. Some people called her obsessed. She preferred to think of it as dedicated to making sure her grandfather's failures didn't define the family legacy any more than his father's crimes already had. On the 10-year anniversary of the center's founding, they held a ceremony at the memorial. Hundreds of people attended, former students who'd gone on to establish successful farms, community members who'd supported the center's work, family members of both the Morrisons and the Chens. Robertson gave a speech about how healing wasn't about forgetting but about transforming pain into purpose. Emma spoke about how land could hold both tragedy and hope, how the same soil that had witnessed Margaret's death now fed students who carried forward the agricultural traditions she and William had represented. They planted a grove of fruit trees that day, apples and pears and cherries that would take years to mature but would eventually provide harvest for generations. Emma thought about how her grandfather had planted trees too, had tended this land for 60 years while carrying the weight of what his father had done. She understood now that he'd been trying, in his limited way, to nurture something good from poison ground. He'd just never found the courage to actually pull the poison out. That evening, after the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, Emma walked through the quiet fields alone. The corn was shoulder-high, rustling in the warm wind. The setting sun painted everything golden. In the distance, she could see students in the greenhouse, probably working late on some project or another, their silhouettes backlit by fluorescent lights. This land had seen everything: hope and violence, love and hatred, silence and truth. It had been stolen and reclaimed, corrupted and cleansed. And now it was teaching again, serving again, fulfilling the purpose that Margaret Morrison and William Chen had believed in before fear and prejudice had destroyed them. Emma stopped at the memorial, running her fingers over the engraved names as she'd done countless times before. The stone was warm from the day's sun, solid and permanent. These names wouldn't be forgotten now. This story wouldn't be buried. The land would remember, and through remembering, would continue to heal. Above her, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Behind her, the farmhouse lights glowed warm and welcoming. Around her, the fields breathed and grew, transformed from sites of shame into places of possibility. Not redeemed, that was too clean a word for such complicated history, but transformed nonetheless into something that served life instead of death, truth instead of silence, justice instead of theft. Emma took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the smell of growing things, and headed back toward the house. There was work to do tomorrow, students to teach, land to tend, legacy to build. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still being written in the soil beneath her feet. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.